Well, as people trickle in and join us this beautiful fall morning, I'm Moira Whalen. I run the Democracy and Technology team at NDI, and I want to welcome all of you for joining us today. We're going to have a fun conversation, really highlighting the importance of democracy and technology, which is a pretty popular issue these days, and one that we put a lot of work into at NDI. But what we really want to highlight today is one that we've been doing this for a really long time, and we brought back some of our distinguished alumni to talk about that, and also how far we have to go and the challenges and the evolution of the space. So that's something that NDI works on in every country in which we work. We do disinformation programs, helping our partners address challenges of data and surveillance, cybersecurity. So this takes up a lot of our time and energy and expands well beyond our team and well beyond NDI to all of our partners and fellow travelers in this space. So we thought it would be great to have a conversation, but also highlight for you the contributions that NDI is making in this space with a revamped dem.tools website, which is live now, and you can go check it out. And we'll walk you through that and then move on to our conversations. So please engage. We look forward to having you join us and ask lots of questions and some witty banter this beautiful morning. So with that, over to you, Jesper.
Thanks, Moira. I'd like to actually throw it to Cliff and Chris to kick off with the demo of our website.
Great, thanks, Jesper. And thanks everybody for joining us here today. And it's so fun and exciting to see some of these past partners in crime here on this panel. Look forward to the discussion coming up in a minute here. So, joining us here is Cliff Wilkes, our lead web developer who built the lovely site that you're going to be seeing as we discuss here. So, it's a digital age, right? Like our partners, the democracy and human rights organizations with whom NDI works around the world, they need to be able to use tools to maximize their effectiveness and learn about how to take advantage of the potential of the internet through guides, manuals, trainings, while keeping themselves safe from all these dangerous risks that were alluded to out there. So there's a huge supply of great free open source software out there, lots of really interesting written resources and manuals, training, and documentation, but it's often very difficult to find. It's difficult for our partners to know what's out there. It's hard to know what to trust. And so our new revamped dem.tools website is meant to be a clearinghouse for a lot of that useful information, a gateway to proven useful software and other resources. So we've got about 97 tools up there now. And Cliff, if you want to pull up the site, he'll be our tour guide as we wander through this new resource that we've built.
Chris, I would love to share the website, but unfortunately the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So as soon as I can get that, I would be very happy to share the site.
Excellent. Try it now.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Great. So as of now, we've got about 97 tools and resources on the site, and we expect that number to grow over time. But what the goal here is not to have every single resource, every single piece of software, every manual or anything that exists out there. There's a lot of them. But instead to be able to provide things that we know and trust that are useful for our democracy and rights partners. Okay, so with this, we've tried to build the site from the perspective of a person coming to it to try and solve particular problems. So we've worked a lot of it into different categories. So if you want to jump over to some of the starting points, Cliff, with a different categorization. So whether you're a political party, whether you're working on political organizing or with parliaments, or you've got an election to monitor, we group tools and resources, manuals and guides together into those sorts of sessions. And then, as you can see here, there's also a robust search function that lets people find what they're looking for by a lot of other different categories as well. Now, as Moira mentioned, the team's been doing this for a long time. We've been thinking and writing about technology for quite a long time, and so the blog remains a central part of this. So you can find past and present writing on a lot of the issues that we've discussed, including about our new launch of demtools here. So you'll find interesting resources there and thought pieces from our team as we write and think about these issues. And for a limited set of tools that are particularly valuable and used commonly by our partners, we also provide what we call our Dem Cloud hosting service. So NDI is able to, for a handful of things, be a software as a service provider where we manage our own infrastructure and are able to provide hosted resources for certain of these tools to our partners around the world. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cliff, who can talk a little bit more specifically about one of the most important aspects of all of our work, which is inclusion and accessibility.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And let's see. So what is digital accessibility? That is making sure that all users across the world despite any sort of disability have access to all your content. And for the biggest one is vision impairment, but there's also auditory and things of that nature. But in terms of addressing vision impairment, one of the things we have to do is address contrast, making sure that basically the text and the color background doesn't kind of blend in. So like a dark red and a black background wouldn't work or anything like that. So that's one of the many things we addressed. And other things we addressed as well are your basic things like making sure that all your images have alt tags. And what that does is that whenever a user uses a screen reader and they navigate the site, that obviously they're not able to see the site, but they can hear what's on the site by those alt tags. And then another way we've also addressed the color contrast issue is that with our links, whenever it's in text, you'll see an underlined link. Therefore, it's very distinguishable as opposed to the rest of the text. So that is the things we do. I think it's pretty easy to understand why accessibility is important. When you have a message that you're trying to reach, especially what NDI does globally, we want to make sure that no users are left out. And so one of the things I say with our department is that I fight for the users because we want to make sure that everyone is counted for and considered in our reach. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Cliff. Back to you, Jesper.
Great, thanks you guys, and thanks for the demo of the website. I hope our audience will take the time to go to it and check it out. And obviously, it's a work in progress and something that we hope to iterate on and continue to grow and make it a better resource for everyone going forward as well. So your feedback is very valued and welcomed. Before I introduce our illustrious panel of NDI Tech alumni, I'll just give a quick introduction to the topic for discussion today. So, as Chris kind of alluded to, we're in an unprecedented moment for technology, and it's a moment of opportunity and challenges for the democracy community. Historically, the democratic processes have struggled to keep up with the rapid pace of technological change. I think that's kind of starting to change a bit. With the COVID pandemic, one of the kind of unintended outcomes or positive outcomes of COVID is actually the adoption of a lot more technological approaches. This meeting, for example, is happening purely online, which benefits users around the world who may not have been able to come to an office space in DC to participate in this meeting. So we've definitely benefited in some ways, and democratic processes are evolving and adopting new technologies to be more effective. By the same token, the more we move our processes online, the more vulnerable we become to surveillance, advertising, and authoritarian influence. So double-edged sword in terms of technology adaptation. The positives are clear, though, things like distance learning, conferencing, advocacy, data collection are all much improved. There's a growing global community of civic tech organizations and technologists who are building these tools and approaches to design for democracy and make sure that the tools that we build and we use are actually benefiting our democratic systems instead of hurting them. But like I said, the current challenge that many democratic actors face is how to utilize technology without having it used against them. So with that, I'll quickly introduce our illustrious panel of NDI, former NDI staff on the NDI tech team, who have gone on to do many cool and amazing things. First, we have Ian Schuler. He was actually the first employee of NDI's DemTech team. He served on NDI's team for 10 years. He's also the founded the Internet Freedom programs at the State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and is currently CEO of a tech company called DevSeed. Matt Bailey is was senior advisor on NDI's DemTech team. And about a year ago, he was a co-founder of Code for DC and currently is the Digital Freedom Program Director at PEN America. Third, Tsai Bennett was a program manager for NDI's Asia team in 2004 through 2010, project manager with the executive office from 2012 to 2014. But she's also served as the State Department's served the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Office for Global Programs as China's team lead, and then Deputy Director of DRL from 2014 to 2019. She's currently the founder of High Ridge Strategies, LLC, a consulting group, and Nonresident Fellow for the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. And last, but certainly not least, is Sarah Oh. Sarah was on NDI's team as our Silicon Valley Partnerships representative and also a member of NDI's governance team. Until last year, she was on Facebook program manager focused on global integrity issues, and is now non-resident senior fellow for the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. That was a lot, but let's get into it. Ian, let's start with you.
Sure.
So beginning in 2001, you spent about a decade working with Democratic partners on technology issues. It feels like a lot has changed since 2001. What has changed and what's stayed the same?
A lot on both sides, for sure. And which is why I'm like really excited to be here talking about all this to you all. I would say, so things that are the same. One is that people will use the tools that allow them to accomplish their goals, the easiest thing that's available to them, right? I remember in 2006, 2007, we had done a few projects. This is when we were just starting to use SMS as a way of collecting information around elections. We piloted it in Palestinian elections and in Montenegro independence elections, and we had gotten a call to see, the field office and the partners in Sierra Leone were interested in trying it there. And I was sent out an assessment to see would cell phone, would text message election monitoring work, using text message to send information about elections work in Sierra Leone. And there was sort of a feeling in the DC office that maybe, but this isn't Montenegro or Palestine, this is Sierra Leone. They may not be ready for something so high tech as that. And of course, when we get there and do the assessment, it's exactly the opposite. That in Sierra Leone, the cell phone infrastructure is by far the most robust and reliable infrastructure for anything. And so if you wanted to send information from around the country, that was always going to be part of the chain. And in fact, the difference that you could make by using this tool there was going to be even greater in terms of the amount of speed and the amount of reports that you were likely to get back as a result. And so, and that's always been the case. And I think it means that people will use the things that help them accomplish their goals. They won't necessarily use the things that you want, the tools that are as secure as you want them to use, or the tools that are built by the people whose intentions are good. They'll use the thing that's there. And I think that's why it's really important, some of the stuff that you all are working on, to make it so that people are almost tripping over the tools that are actually the sorts of things that are going to help them to be successful, and that you're making them as accessible and available as possible, really thinking about users, because I think that we need more of those out there. Things that are different. Well, the other thing I would say that's the same is that the nature of the internet, the pace of change and development and these sort of small pieces, loosely joined nature means that nimble, agile actors will always have a first mover advantage. And we've seen that in a number of cases. But then at the same time, the network effects of tech and the economies of scale mean that they eventually lend themselves to centralization and control a lot of these tools as well. So you do have that dual-sided aspect, Jesper, that you were talking about. Things that are different, there's a lot that's different, all of which I would love to get into. The open data movement, open government movement has evolved a lot over the last 10 years. The rise of cloud computing and all the good, the bad, and the ugly of that, the then following rise of AI, and really not just the development of AI techniques, but the application of AI techniques in a lot of different areas, and the good, the bad, and the ugly related to that. A recognition that social media isn't a unmitigated advancer of democracy is something that's really developed over the last decade. Global climate activism and activism around things that are global problems that have to be solved, can only be solved globally. These are all interesting new trends. I would say the biggest thing that is different from a decade ago is the inevitability of the democracy project overall. And there was a feeling even a decade ago that the arc of history will eventually lead towards democracy, and that tech, if anything, was an accelerator of that trend. And I think we're seeing very clearly that is not inevitable at all in that decade since. Actually, we've seen the greatest deterioration of democracy and democratic institutions in the US and US allies. And so this is a struggle that everybody needs to be fighting everywhere. And the technology tools are kind of, as you said, yes, a double-edged sword in how we pursue that. And we've seen very much authoritarian and fascist, nimble authoritarian and fascist elements using technology as a way of advancing their goals against their democratic governments. So I think there's a lot to talk about. So a lot on all sides, and happy to dig into it any bit more.
Great, thanks, Ian. Why don't we jump to you, Matt? You got your start in civic tech, help building tech solutions for government. In your experience, what are the biggest barriers to getting government up to speed? To civil society organizations in today's digital world need to be technologists as well as advocates for civil rights. Over to you.
Yeah, well, and I think, jumping off what Ian was just saying, 10 years ago, it seemed obvious that we wanted governments to have more technology, in a broad sense. And, there's a lot of talk about government as a platform, and some sense that open government would lead to accountable government in some directly causal way. Man, you say the word government today, especially, well, actually in any context, and there's a real inflection there, or a sense there that you need to be wary about how you build more effective government, because more effective might mean more effective services and more pluralistic and inclusive and accessible, like Cliff was talking about, but it also can mean more effective at clamping down. And, of course, we're having our own problems domestically, but you can also look at sort of what's increasingly being referred to as the Chinese model. I think that there's some limitations to that term, of trying to sort of have your cake and eat it too, have a robust, digitally driven economy and strong technology with the government for surveillance and other purposes, but in the absence of democratic freedoms, in the absence of meaningful participation of residents and citizens in how the government actually behaves itself. So with all of that as preface, I think that, if you assume that you're talking about a space, whether that's municipal, subnational, national, where the government needs more technology and needs to get better at it, I think that there's one fundamental issue about technology. It's not only a double-edged sword in the ways we've been talking about, sort of a force extender for good or bad, but also, even assuming good intentions, the difference between a technology implementation that looks good on the surface and seems like it'll help, and one that actually has good as opposed to deleterious or just expensive results, often really requires actual technologists to be in the loop somewhere. So, if you think about city governments, it's often very hard anywhere in the world to afford or find tech talent that you can bring in as civil servants to be sort of impartial arbiters of any sort of technology implementation or procurement or partnership. But that's always the preferred thing to do. Anytime you can build real meaningful technology expertise directly inside of government, that's the best thing to do. But part of what I'm excited about demtools and about a lot of the projects that are represented here is that the second best thing is to find civil society actors, partners that you can work with who are not the same people who are trying to sell you the technology or sell you the development services, who can just advise you and help you spot the difference between vaporware or bullshit or stuff that's going to take you down a really bad path where surveillance becomes really easy in alignment with political priorities, and differentiate that between something like that and something that's actually going to help you achieve democratic aims and policy objectives. So I love this resource because I'm hopeful that in a small way it can help accelerate the ways that civil society can work with government to make that differentiation.
Awesome, thank you. And you have a deep background in China. You were one of the first professional staffer of the Congressional Executive Commission on China in 2002. We kind of talked a little bit about authoritarian actors and how they're influencing democracy and technology space, but maybe you can give us a sense of how the space has changed over the years.
Sure, I will happily discuss that. And I think talking about the China context for the last 20 years, when I think about what Matt just said about how folks had thought that the sort of democratization of governance through technology would actually help governments be better, I think 20 years of experience with China, I always saw it from government as the bad actor, and how does civil society use technology to pursue their goals, because that's what we've long dealt with in mainland China in particular, where civil society activists, long before this was on anyone else's radars, but I was dealing with this from, over a decade ago, were trying to find ways where they could jump their firewall, where they could use technology to help advance their goals, to connect with each other. And that's been, I think, what we've seen today in terms of other activists around the world using technology to advance their activism, connect with others across the world. That's where it's really evolved, I think, in terms of where I see the positive role of technology. I'll always be Pollyannish about this because I see it very much from how civil society uses it, and how civil society will always look for ways to advance their agenda, to promote human rights, to focus on democracy, to connect with other activists when they're backed into a corner, and they will look for those other people across the world. And I've seen that, over the decades in China, where it's been the most repressive, or one of, technically one of the most repressive areas for a very long time. And yet we still saw people connect and advance agendas for quite a while, even more challenging now, of course. But to me, it's never been about whether and how government can be a better actor, but often about how civil society can use technology to push government to be a better actor, and engage in a space and a conversation in ways that they have a hard time doing in real life. So that's sort of my spiel. And I can talk about the China issue and China motivations too around the world and what we're looking at. Definitely not the model that I would ever want anyone to look towards, but definitely what we're seeing around the world and where other countries are looking to when can they control in the way that the CCP does control the internet and space and dialogue in China. And I think I feel like we can open up the conversation later to sort of how folks are countering that and engaging to push back. I think I'd like to touch on what Ian said earlier too, in terms of the evolution of DemTech. I was not on the DemTech team. I'm definitely not a tech team person, but I've just sort of been a longtime NDI person and DRG program and policy professional for a while. And we've seen just the evolution of technology programming has evolved with the fact of how the world has used the internet and technology over time. So I remember thinking of technology programs as being a little bit more static back in the day, where it was like, how do you take a training module and put it on the internet and so that someone could watch it? Or some of the most exciting early stuff that Ian's talking about with the SMS, use of SMS and election monitoring scene was like incredible and mind-blowing, definitely hard for a lot of old guard at NDI back in the day to kind of wrap their heads around. And now today we see how dynamic the use of technology is when it comes to democracy programming and not that sort of static type of programming we used to think of it back when just program world was different. And so it's come a long way, and there's still lots of positives that have come out of the evolution. And I think this platform, this site that you guys have built to make it all easy for activists and I guess good government people who care on the government side is really powerful. And as Ian said too, making it easy for people and making it easy for the user is so critical. And so to have this resource is massive and really exciting. So thank you to NDI for pulling it together.
Great, thanks so much. Sarah, just kind of to go back to this theme about tech being a double-edged sword, how is big tech thinking about how technology and social media platforms in particular impact democracy around the world?
Thanks, Jasper, and so nice to be back talking about this issue. It's a fun exercise to think about where we've been the last decade. And I want to comment on something that Anne mentioned. We talk a lot about the beginning of this conversation being technology being this positive force for democracy and governance, and that it's no longer net good. I've also seen a mini evolution somewhere in between there and now, in where the conversation is moving past this binary good or bad. And I think Anne touched on this a little bit in the dynamic way we're seeing activists using technology, often because it's no longer a choice to not use it. Right, I've learned a lot in watching activists in Hong Kong, for example, making the daily calculation around how they're going to use technology, which tool for how, what to leverage. And so I think there's something there too to think about. And it's relevant, to go back to your question, in how companies are grappling with it. I mean, when I started working at Facebook a few years ago, after working at NDI on the tech portfolio, there was one person whose job it was to work on human rights. That's obviously changed. There's a dramatic scaling up within the industry across many companies, not only to focus on rights-based issues, but also in-region staffing groups that do engagement with civil society. And however imperfect, I think it's important to recognize that surface area is increased. And I think it's largely due to how complex and dynamic the intersection of all these rights-based issues, expression, being able to speak truth to power are intertwined in social media. The most obvious examples that I see of what Matt and Ian touched on and the negative impacts of social media and democracy are the authoritarian abuse, which I know this community is well-versed in, but also the amplification of polarizing content, the silencing of marginalized voices, people who are speaking truth to power. And so these are all issues that are really important for everyone to grapple with. And some of it, I think, that we can talk about it, I do think is a natural result of growth in the global South. But I still think we can attribute a lot of this change in staffing and engagement to the deepening of conversation about social media and democracy.
So can I jump off that actually?
Go ahead, yeah, please.
Yeah, I just have a question for kind of the group here as well, right? I think if you look a decade ago, I remember there would be hearings about technology-related things, and members of Congress would say, "Oh, the geeks will figure that out." Right? There was a sense that government, like that, this was not a thing of politics. This was a thing that like the geeks will figure out how to do. And now that's very much changed, right? Like members of Congress realize that they have to be more engaged in understanding the tech and its implications, and very much are. And I think that that's a good thing overall. Government needs to be more knowledgeable and cognizant, but I think we're also seeing a wave of interest in greater government involvement and regulation, which could have positive elements, but a lot of this is also going to be used as templates and justifications for how this is run out and all around the world. How do you all think about, if you're advising well-intentioned governments on how to regulate or how to manage social media and other technology industries, to not overreach, to not like creating possibilities for censorship, or overreach, for the erosion of exactly what we've spent decades fighting for, the freedom of speech, assembly, and association online. Like, where do you feel like we are right now? I think that a decade ago, it was like, keep government out, let the private, keep government, the right answer is keep government out. And I don't know that that's as comfortable an answer for most people these days, but what is the answer? How do you all think about it?
I think that's a great question, Ian, if you guys don't mind me jumping in first. I think that the gut reaction a lot of government folks are having now is to reach a little too far, right? It's always that pendulum swing, people's initial reaction to it. So it's somewhere before you get to the point where there's government overreach. I don't have the answer for what that actually looks like. I think about, I don't know, how do they regulate the broadcasting industry if you're talking about on the free speech side of things, ensuring that you can have free speech, you can have the content that needs to be out there, but what is that line? I'm not an expert in this, but I know this is a really hard conversation, but that a lot of knee-jerk legislators' reactions now is that they're tempted to go a little bit too far on it. I definitely am of the mindset that there needs to be some kind of regulation, more government involvement. It has been a bit too Wild West, but what is that balance? Because the CCP certainly has its model that it's trying to push out, and it's a totally alternative universe. And that's not the direction we want the world to go. So that's just my 2 cents. I think we'll just open it up.
Before other people joined in, I just want to quickly note that, I want this to be a conversation with our audience as well. Please use the Q&A feature to throw in any questions to help guide this conversation. If there's burning questions that you want to ask our illustrious panel, please throw them in there, and we'll make sure to answer them both throughout the conversation, and there will also be time at the very end just to do Q&A.
Can I just say we have an illustrious audience of lots of alums who we all know quite well. So I don't know if any of us necessarily feel like we should be called illustrious.
I would love to come in on that question. It's such a good one. And I'm actually quite worried about the dissonance that I see around the discussions that are happening among governments about regulation, and the enormous wealth of coordination, experience, deep discussions that the internet freedom community has been engaged in the last 10 years. And I would just say simply, if there are people working in government, legislatures at the executive level who are actively engaged on these issues and really want to enshrine rights and democracy in these discussions, closer coordination with civil society who've been working on these issues, I think, is essential. And I unfortunately don't know if I see that happening as much as perhaps I think would potentially be useful. The good news is there's a lot of great forums and mechanisms that already exist where these discussions have been happening for a long time, and many of the alums who are on this call have been part of those discussions. And I think over the next few years, it would behoove us to find a way to bridge those conversations in communities more closely.
I agree with that. And I think, you know, we talk about that sort of paradigm shift, which also feels, it's one of those sort of things that fills me with chagrin, having been working in this space for so long, like the shift from the inevitability of democracy and the inevitability of the internet as part of that story to where we are now. I think a good way of thinking about it is that the internet is almost everywhere now. And, you know, that'll only become more true over time, is becoming more and more true at a faster pace with every undersea cable that's laid, and with better and better mobile infrastructure. The internet today is inherently geopolitical. So, you know, there's a lot of like hand wringing about the splitternet, this idea that the dream of a like global free internet is falling before our eyes as CCP does what it's doing, as Russia builds its own sort of independent DNS infrastructure and takes all other kinds of measures to be able to essentially put a curtain around the country, either immediately or at their choosing, as various other countries around the world look at those two countries and even at some things that are happening in the US and start to adopt their own strategies. And that hand wringing is righteous. Like those are bad things that are happening. But when you get caught up on this dichotomy of a global free internet versus a splinternet, you're tying yourself into something that's already in the past. And it is constraining our thinking about what we want the future to be. So, you know, there's a lot of good things that are happening. A lot of in my opinion, the reforms, at least the spirit of the reforms that are happening around data protection and privacy and empowering users in the EU are broadly speaking good. You can always quibble over the fine print. And it's hard to see how contending with the global corporate internet, the capture of the internet by global corporate powers, can be contended with except on a country by country or block by block basis. Because we don't have the tools to handle that at a global scale. So, you know, my hope is that we can find a synthesis of those two views of a global free internet that's free for all of the democratic and self-expressive things that we wanted it to be free for in, you know, 1990 when we were all watching Hackers, and yet where political action to contend with both wayward state political power and with corporate power is still possible. And I don't think I don't think that those are actually inherently in conflict, but the terms of the debate are wrong today. They're outdated.
Yeah, Sarah, you know, there's been a lot of focus on social media's tendency to divide us and be a negative influence on democracy. You know, can technology be an equally powerful tool for, you know, bringing people together and creating a space for civil discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that criticism is important. Amplification of hate and hateful content is one of the greatest unintended consequences of social media, in my view, in the last few years. In spite of everything that we've all just said about how technology is scary and bad and terrible, I do see some creative efforts trying to leverage social media, even in this current environment. There's great groups that came out of the aftermath of the US elections, trying to bring together disparate communities to talk online. One of my favorite projects, for those of you who may not have heard of them, is called Spaceship Media, based in California. And they curate conversations with communities that are in conflict with each other. This stuff doesn't happen by accident. These aren't organic conversations happening. They take a lot of work and curation, but when they happen, it's pretty interesting to see what constructive engagement on really difficult, polarizing issues can look like. So projects like that give me optimism that there are opportunities to leverage social media for bridging conversations.
And I love to tag on to what Sarah just said to emphasize there is so much positive to come out. I mean, technology and social media in the end are just for tools. They're tools, and any tool can be used for good and for bad. And behind everything are sort of humans who are then manipulating them. So I think in repressive regime contexts, for a decade, we've seen not just social media being used amplifying really bad things, but also really positive conversations as well, in a way for people to engage in a public discourse that maybe they couldn't normally in person or in sort of another type of formal format. So I also think that currently too, we see it as a way for activists across borders to be able to have conversations with one another to talk about how to deal with, counter democracy, or the sort of backslide of democracy in their regions, or in the rise of authoritarianism, repression of human rights. All of these things are all things that today I see lots of communities across the world connecting with one another in ways that they would never have before. That was accelerated in the last year and a half of the pandemic, with people just doing everything from home at this point.
And just, as a tiny, practical example of that, I feel like a map of where the internet is available and where broadband is available, and a map of where LGBTQ people are, it's critical infrastructure for them to live their lives, literally to exist, that's the same map. So it's easy to get caught up in this politics of paranoia about QAnon or whatever the local flavor is, and that's true. But it's easy to take for granted those powerful positive uses that didn't exist.
Yeah, and I wonder if tying this back to how we approach regulation, rather than having governments regulate the technology itself, which seems like it's so hard to keep up with and do in a way that's going to be productive, that regulating the models around it might be, particularly dealing with that, with the corporate issues, make it harder to make money off of disinformation, make it harder to make money off of algorithmic amplification of hate, right? And that is something that governments are better at, where they can maybe shift the balance away from some of the negative aspects of what we're seeing towards an environment that makes it easier for people to be successful and lifts up the more positive. It seems like there's some questions in chat. Jesper, do you want to jump into?
Yeah, sure. We've got a question from Finland. Do democracy tools, the dangers like how digital technology is being easily weaponized to manipulate netizens? So I guess the question is, can tools that would, not necessarily have a negative use or a negative intent be manipulated to hurt democracy?
Definitely. I guess I'd read that as within the DEM tools, the tools that you all have. Do you have anything within that set that you would point to as ways in societies where technology is being used and disinformation? What are the things that you would point to? Maybe I missed.
Okay. Yeah. I can quickly answer that. Yeah, there are one big project that we have at NDI is on information integrity and protecting the information space in societies. And one big piece of that is our focus on monitoring the information space for disinformation or misinformation, empowering fact checkers and other civil society actors to be a force for the truth in a society. And we have tools online. If you search for countering disinformation or use the drop down under tool categories for countering disinformation. There are a number of tools there for media monitoring, social media listening, that kind of stuff that are very helpful.
Is there also, I mean, I see Shem Ayera's comment here as well about things that they're struggling with. And I wonder if you all can comment also. One of the great things about demtools is that you provide highly privileged open knowledge, like open source tools and also open documents. And the great thing about that is other people can contribute as well. Ideally, you would have a pretty robust environment where NDI and other people like NDI are creating some of these tools, but also creating the environment for other people to engage in further development of those. How are you all thinking about more engagement of technologists within countries that you're operating in the development and maintenance and use of those tools? Or maybe Chris or Moira or someone else has some, or Jesper, if you have thoughts on that.
So sorry, I was reading one of the questions.
Oh, no, sorry. No, that's fair. I was just asking, like, how is NDI engaging developers, and particularly since a lot of your tools are open source, how are you thinking about engaging developers in countries where NDI is working in building and contributing to some of these projects?
I can jump in
ahead,
a little
Moira.
bit if you want me to. So it's a good question. And I think, even that has evolved over time, right? So, when NDI started demtools, there was really a gap in terms of what CivTech was developing and what tools were available and affordable, frankly, to our partners around the world. And there was the need to design, basic things that fueled our parallel vote tabulation, creating a CRM so that people could, crowd build, and we maintain all of those tools. But what I think is great is that where we are now is there's such a robust civil society and CivTech community globally that, NDI has been a part of sort of expanding the Code for All network, and helping to grow that community to where now what we really need to do is work with advocate to the donor community that they need to sustain this space, because we see lots of great tools like Signal being developed and other tools that partners need. But, the developers have lives and kids that need to eat food, and, they're often targets themselves. So like, we've got to create that career path and sustain that community of developers that want to do good and don't just want to produce something awesome and then 10 years later take a job at Google. And, so there's an importance for advocacy on the side to the donor community. And then I think the other side of it is making sure that our partners, we sort of, NDI's traditional partners of political parties, parliaments, things like that, plugging them in with the CivTech builders, right? Making those partnerships happen so that they can begin to, the change makers can connect with the developers and they can design better products to enable them and increase opportunities for democratic action, but also the change makers begin to see the needs of that community in terms of open source, transparency within government, things like that. So I also think, there's one of the benefits, and you all know this, of being part of NDI and part of this global network is we're able to sort of connect our friends and make good things happen without having to necessarily do it ourselves. And that's always been that power of networking and convening has always been the heart of all the work you all have done and continue to do. But at least from my perspective is really the evolving critical role that we play.
Thanks, Maura.
See another question from Aziza, and she's talking about how as an organizer in contexts where there may not be reliable internet or smartphones, a lot of these tools that are listed on the website may not actually be very good or useful in those circumstances. one quick response to that would be, the right tool may not necessarily be digital in a given context. Pen and paper is a technology that might actually work better in some places. And one thing that NDI endeavors to do with our partners is start from an understanding of the context and the problem, and then working backwards to the technology solution that would work for that context. So always starting with the problem and working backwards to the solution instead of trying to impose a certain solution on the problem.
If I can get on a quick soapbox on that too. I mean, I do think one thing particularly for those of us in the builder space and in the organization like the NDIs of the world is just being the way that Cliff talked about accessibility. Like accessibility is also how heavy is your website? And if I'm in a place where my internet is metered either by the time that I'm spending in an internet cafe, or actually I'm paying by the bit, then how are we providing tools that minimize that and make it as accessible and as cheap as possible for me to get the information and connection that I need? And the cost of download is a real social justice issue in areas we work in. I think for a while, even in the time that I was there, we relied on big, heavy content management systems because that was the easiest way for us to quickly build. But those were really hard to load in a lot of places and had a real cost for end users. And so as the technology changes and it gets easier to build light, like trying to err on the side of light is an important part of accessibility as well.
And I want to just weigh in as a former donor on the U.S. government side of things. Whereas, technology and digital tools super important for integrating into all sorts of programs. It's not the end all be all. Should never be sort of the first thing out there, because in the end, everything still has to translate into real world action and real life environments. And so it's not necessarily always going to be the thing that's up front when you're a civil society group on the ground in country X, but it's just something that, again, provides very useful platforms, is a tool that can be used for, as we see, good, bad, and the gray zone. So there's no one answer. And I think the purpose of this conversation is looking at this plethora of tools that are openly available out there that NDI has pulled together as an incredible resource for those who are looking for different types of technology tools that they can use in their own work. So that's sort of where I come at it from, where it's never going to be the end all be all, but it's such an integrated aspect of many people's lives now.
I think also,
sorry, go ahead.
I think, just to kind of step back a bit, like to kind of zoom out, I said something similar in the chat earlier, but in places that are digitizing, the internet, 10 years ago, the internet would arrive and you would sort of have SMS or 10 or 15 SMS, and you'd kind of have a chance to get used to the idea of data flying around and that neighboring, towns could talk to each other, individuals could connect with anybody in the world. And then gradually more and more would come online. But today what you have is sort of almost instantaneous, relatively speaking, movement from low digitization to like everybody's on Facebook and Facebook groups and on WhatsApp. And so it's extraordinary, both from the standpoint of like how quickly you can go from a low tech, low bandwidth environment to all of the tech and all of the cultural change arrives instantaneously. It's incredibly disruptive, even if there's a lot of positive things that come with it. So I think, something that we all need to figure out how to do, and I think demtools is like a good entry there, but we have to figure out how to get better at this, is talking about how to arm people to rapidly spool up. So depending on the context you're in, it might be that pen and paper is the right solution today. And then all of a sudden next year you go, oh my God, that this isn't the right thing. Or it seems like there's some new possibilities that we can use Signal or other tools to address. But you have to rapidly build up the entire community's tech fluency to know how to do that without exposing yourselves, because you're in an arms race with the local telecoms or the government to exploit those vulnerabilities. And I think that very unfortunately, with all of the upheaval that we've seen, the democratic retreat, with climate change, we're also seeing the reverse situation, one in which you can have all of this scaffolding of democratic technology and democratic systems, and it can come tumbling down in a heartbeat. I mean, you can look just at Myanmar and Afghanistan, just to take two very tragic recent examples. These are situations in which there was a lot of investment in building up technology fluency. Myanmar is sort of the extraordinary, example out of the globe in some ways. And overnight, the context of that technology completely was shattered. And so I think we need to look at not only how to provide tools that are appropriate for lower bandwidth or lower tech fluency environments, but also how to accommodate those rapid shifts up or down in the amount of technology and bandwidth that's available.
Great, thanks, Matt. I wanted to quickly read out a few questions, and then you guys can kind of answer them through the conversation. One came in from Chika from Japan, saying that language is a barrier to creating kind of a global democracy community around tech. How do we work better together globally? How do we connect to solve these problems together? And then the other question from Richard Haddock. Are there global examples of DemTech innovations that are providing promising models for strengthening democratic institutions, particularly in places like Taiwan? So opening those two questions up to y'all.
Yes, but I think I'll just clarify Richard's question, because I think he's talking about Taiwan as a great as a model, and so being encouraged by that. So I think it's about what are some other examples like that, or if we're engaging on the government side.
Why don't you take that one in?
Yeah, I mean, I think of Taiwan as like one of the sort of stellar models in terms of on the government side, and also in terms of the civ tech community there being on the front lines and super cutting edge. I'm not as steeped in terms of which other governments would be, as shining models in terms of engagement for strengthening democratic.
I think one thing that NDI does really well is as a convener of these different groups and elevating actors like Taiwan, the people in Taiwan who are doing this great work of technology, and allowing them to share, kind of to jump off the question from our audience member from Japan. That's one thing that NDI really endeavors to do, is kind of create these opportunities for cross-country sharing of best practices and good models for technological governance.
I'll just jump in to kind of tie to the two questions. Richard's other question was around how do you get governments more involved? I think like one of the opportunities that NDI really has is engaging local developer communities, and that's important for translation purposes, because these are all open tools, and by bringing in other developer communities, they can translate into these tools and resources into local languages. And also, I mean, I think like ideally where we would get to is a point where there are robust civic tech communities within around the world. And a lot of what the role of an organization like NDI is like eating those initial costs of creating infrastructure that makes it cheaper and easier for those other organizations to be able to sustainably deploy and build out tools, even within their own government, solving problems in society, in a way that there is like a business model around it that doesn't always. I think there will always be things that need to be donor supported, but there is a set of things around civic tech that if NDI makes it cheaper and easier to build the core tools that local group of technologists can get contracts from municipal governments and national governments within their own country to implement some of these things that create opportunities for participation and all the stuff that exists in other countries. So I think that's a really cool opportunity for NDI going forward as it grows in this space.
And that's the one thing that we've kind of tried to do with the demtools website, is we've tagged every language that a tool has been translated into, and have made it searchable so that folks from a certain country can know which tools are native in their language. So hopefully that list of tools will grow over time, and we can continue editing and innovating that list, and encouraging our contacts in these tech companies to continue to translate those tools. Sarah, I wanted to kind of bring it back a little bit to the fact that, NDI over the years has concentrated on the impact of technology on women and marginalized communities in particular. How far have we come, and what do we need to do to create, an information space that's inclusive?
I mean, I think this is one of those issues where things have gotten worse, right? All the data that we see is really troubling. Every issue that has been discussed on this call disproportionately impacts women. The ability for women to run for office, write stories, if you're a journalist, exist in your society. So I'm really worried about the experience of women and non-binary people online. There's, if folks on the call haven't seen, there was also a really harrowing data point in one of the recent Facebook files about how much worse it is for women in newly connected countries and global South countries. So I think that things are changing. Companies, largely thanks to civil society rising to the occasion, are beginning to engage in a conversation. I'm hopeful, maybe just to end on an optimistic note, that the foundation that NDI and others in the democracy community have built around this issue, built on a very deep bench of expertise on gender issues, will help shine and lead the way. Similarly, similar to how the community led the conversation on misinformation and disinformation 10 years ago. So I think that's what I look to. And I really think we all need to remember that the problems and the experiences that marginalized communities are having online right now really are a bellwether of larger issues at the intersection of society and tech. So it really urgently needs attention from all of us at a systemic level.
Great. I think we're edging over time here, but if anyone has any final comments on inclusion or any other topic that we covered today, feel free.
I'd say just to tag on to what Sarah just said, and I couldn't support that to support that 200% in terms of her comments, but that a lot of that entails breaking through the silos and having all the experience from different aspects of civil society as well come together to figure out these issues, because I think in places like NDI traditionally, I don't think anymore, but there have been tech programs, everything is sort of in its grouping, and that's not how the world works anymore, and we're seeing all the bleeding over of everything. So I think the critical aspect here too, I think going a little bit to Richard's question of what have been challenges to training or transforming governments to be partners in STEM tech innovation, is really ensuring that a place like NDI and others can help be the conveners to bring together civil society and government, whether it's talking about technology innovation, other issues, to really have that nexus for the conversation and interaction. And that's really critical if we're going to move forward on societal change and figuring out these problems together.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks to our panel for spending this morning with us, and thanks to our audience for joining and sharing some really interesting questions. I hope that you will log on, check out our website, and this is just the beginning of this conversation. So I hope that you'll continue to engage with us, suggest new tools that maybe we forgot to add to the website, suggest changes that you think we need to, a way we should categorize these tools that it hasn't been categorized, or a change that you want to see in the website. We'll be happy to address those comments and suggestions. So thanks so much. We'll be posting this online if you want to go back and revisit it, and hopefully talk to you all at some other point later. Thank you.